Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, for your time and giving us this opportunity to talk to you. You were in Kabul recently, and you have met with several Taliban officials, civil society activists, women, and other activists. After this trip, you mentioned that there are some changes happening. Have you found any changes in the Taliban's behavior or policies toward forming a legitimate, representative, and exclusive government in Afghanistan?
Thank you for having me. Indeed, I visited Kabul beginning of October, so it's about a month ago, and speaking to you now from Brussels, where I'm based. During the talks we had, and I think that may be what you were referring to, in Kabul, I found from speaking to a large number of civil society activists, business people, and so on, and I should have known that before, of course, that the situation varies quite a lot across the country. This is not new, but also that the situation in terms of, shall we call it, policy implementation seems to vary. That in some provinces there were better possibilities to, for example, for NGOs to register, for businesses to keep running, and so on, and more of an openness to dialogue from governors, from Taliban officials than in other places. I saw this at the point as something positive. And this reflected also the impression that many of my interlocutors gave. But what we have seen in the meantime is also a rotation of governors between provinces, several new appointments also at acting minister level, with a new acting minister for higher education, for example. And I haven't yet done a thorough analysis. But if we look at some of these rotations and changes, combined with increasing signs of Kandahar, whoever is calling the shot, whatever name we give him or that group, to take further control and to have a more direct say about policy implementation in the provinces, I'm not so sure, or I'm perhaps less optimistic than I was a month ago about what real opportunities and possibilities these openings and these differences across provinces really offer.
The Taliban have made several promises to you and to international community before, and they also promised some promises in the Doha Agreement. However, they have not kept their promises, such as they are not allowing girls to go to school, they are not allowing women to participate in the public life, and forming an exclusive government. Does the international community, including yourself, trust the Taliban?
I agree with you that many of the promises given, first of all, and I would change the order to the Afghan people, and secondly, in some ways and in some meetings to international partners, very few of those have been kept. To me, trust is based on honesty in the conversation, is based on keeping promises, is based on being clear when you cannot keep promises about why this happens. And if I take one example, the opening of secondary schools for girls throughout the country, we were told again and again that the opening of schools is in line with the policy of the Taliban, that it is not against Islam, not even in their understanding of Islam, and that there were some practical obstacles, and those precise obstacles have been different in different meetings. There have been talks about the need to separate girls and boys in schools, which was the case before. There has been talk about a lack of female teachers. there have been references to lack of school buses and transport and things like that. But we hear less and less, and that was a real concern to me, both when I spoke to representatives of the Taliban, the de facto authorities in in Tashkent, in Uzbekistan this summer, and when I met in Kabul. We hear less and less promises that something is happening. In May and in March when we met, there were references to these obstacles. They were being addressed and schools would open shortly. I didn't hear that last time. And that in this specific case makes me less hopeful. And it overall reduces my, let's call it trust. Trust, the lack of trust or the lack of ability to deliver can depend on various things. And I would probably see that part of the inability or unwillingness to deliver may very well be that the people we are talking to, the acting ministers, are less in the loop, are less knowledgeable themselves about where the country is going and what the policy from Kandahar will be. So in that sense, perhaps there is an honesty on their part in not making promises any longer, but it's of course still worrying for us that they are not.
They are saying that it's that the opening of the secondary school is due to some logistical problems, as you mentioned as well. But girls' schools were opened before the Taliban takeover, and people of Afghanistan also demand this, and it's a basic right. Do you think that the reason that they are providing for opening the girls' school is legitimate, is rational?
I'm not convinced that the so-called obstacles that they put on the table are the real obstacles. And I see it much more as a political issue, quite obviously. We were reassured in mid-March when we were in Kabul that schools would open the following week. It was announced, and then they didn't. And again, I think we come back to discussions that apparently took place in Kandahar, where parts of the leadership, or perhaps the senior leadership, was not convinced. Why were they not convinced? One interpretation would be that they are actually against girls' education. They don't see the importance of girls being educated because they see women playing a different role in society than officially declared and what the rest of the world sees, including Muslim majority countries. Another possibility could be that what they fear was the division within the movement among the Taliban, and that the main reason was not so much, let's say, disagreement about the policy, but the fact that there was disagreement within the movement. I'm not sure which factor is the most important one, but I think the main reason was certainly, or the main decision it is basically a political decision rather than a question of separated classrooms or school buses or resources, as I see it.
Whether the minimum benchmarks for the EU for recognition of the Taliban, is there a benchmark that could lead ultimately to the recognition of the Taliban by the EU?
I don't think this is quantifiable, but I don't think we have, a list of 3 items or a particular level that should be reached. But we have been quite, I think, consistent and clear from the beginning, from last year when we started having conversations with the Taliban. And I should underline, these are not negotiations. We have not entered into a position of give and take. We try to understand each other and make our expectations clear. And I have reasons to believe that senior ministers know about them, because they can recite them as well as I can. And we talk about 5 benchmarks, and they are about safe passage for Afghans who want to and need to leave the country. It's about humanitarian access, that our assistance should be delivered throughout the country to people who need it most without interference from the Taliban. It's about human rights, and human rights going beyond the rights of women, but including the rights of women, the rights of minorities, media freedom, etc. It's about an inclusive government, and we may come back to that perhaps. And it's about the Taliban keeping their commitments on counterterrorism, to make sure that their neighbors are not being threatened by terrorist organizations inside the country, that other countries are not being threatened by terrorist organizations inside the country. And this goes beyond the Doha Agreement with the US. This is, of course, also about the UN, sticking to the UN Charter and the respect of international law. And on these, overall, I think the Taliban have performed pretty poorly. In some areas, it has gone better when it comes to safe passage, for example. There are still issues. There are issues around huge amounts being asked for passport, for example. But overall, a lot of Afghans have been able to, when they have been in need and needed to leave the country, been able to leave. Humanitarian access, I would have argued until early this year, went reasonably well, and it is going reasonably well. However, we see increased pressure from the Taliban of where they want to control and direct, and there is a firm pushback from the humanitarian community on that, and that's very important. But on human rights and on inclusivity, we see not so much progress. And if I look at, for example, Special Rapporteur Richard Bennett's report to the Human Rights Council, he does acknowledge some positive elements, but overall it's a very bleak and dark report. On inclusivity, bringing in non-Taliban, women, other political factions into the government, or at a minimum having a dialogue with other groups. There again, we see very little progress. And on counterterrorism, I think it's probably a mixed bag. The presence of Al-Qaeda leader in Kabul until July was an indication that they were not fully delivering. I think they're probably making good efforts in combating, in fighting with, encountering Daesh successfully to some extent, but they remain a threat inside the country mainly. And we have seen also concerns by some of the neighbors about the threats coming from Afghanistan from various organizations, be it TTP, be it ETIM, be it IMU, against these countries. So we are not anywhere close to a point of recognition. I also heard, was it yesterday or today, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov saying that the Taliban will not be invited to the Moscow format meeting because they have not managed to form an inclusive government. That may be one of the reasons. So it's not only an EU request concern, it is pretty much something we see from the neighbors, and also from a country such as Russia, where for the moment we have severe differences on political issues.
As you have mentioned, but there are credible reports of gathering of foreign terrorists in many parts of Afghanistan, including ETIM and Tajik fighters and TTP. As you mentioned, the Taliban are claiming that they are fighting those groups, but we have credible reports that they are providing to some groups, shelter, identity card, even passports. So how worried about this are you and the EU are for the future of stability in the region and in Afghanistan?
I should say immediately that we lack a lot of information about what is going on. It is difficult to get, and of course the intelligence work and the reports and media reports are much less detailed than they were before. But we are concerned, and it's not. The concern is perhaps not immediately about the security or the safety of the EU or EU citizens or EU member states that may come. Our immediate concern, or my immediate concern, is about Afghans who we see being attacked by Daesh and to some extent by other organizations. Attacks against places of worship, against mosques, against schools. And that undermines, I think, and should be a concern, and I think it is a concern for the Taliban, because it undermines the claim by the Taliban that they brought peace and security to the country. Yes, it is easier, it is safer for many Afghans, and in particular men, to travel in Afghanistan. Access is better, roads are safer. But if we see the number of suicide attacks and other attacks against civilians going up, that claim is less credible. Secondly, I think it's a concern, and that's my second concern for neighboring countries. We have seen some of them, including Pakistan, taking direct action against TTP, as they say. It also had a severe impact in that case, that specific case, against civilians who were branded as sympathizers to the TTP. We know, of course, that the security of Afghanistan and the security and stability of the region are so closely linked. And the first and the best guarantee for Afghan security, I think, is and for the Taliban, is to have happy neighbors, or neighbors who are at least not worried and sleepless at night. And if they cannot guarantee that these groups do not constitute a threat, do not carry out attacks to the neighboring countries, it's a real concern for them. So these two aspects are the ones I think most about, and I think it undermines the long-term stability of the country. And this is not what I wish for. We wish to see a secure and stable Afghanistan where people can live and prosper and where the rights are respected. So we really hope, we urge, we call on the Taliban to take action against these organizations, cut the ties where they need to, stop resources if resources are being provided, and take very firm action against organizations and notably, of course, Daesh.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Some opposition groups of the Taliban thinks the EU only engages with the Taliban and the EU is not paying attention to them. Is there any channel that you're talking with the opposition groups, such as National Resistance Front or other political group which is formed recently?
Our contacts with Afghans are not limited to contacts with acting ministers. We speak to civil society, we speak to journalists, we speak to the business community, we speak to human rights defenders. As I mentioned, I talked to you from Brussels today, and we had also a meeting. We facilitated a meeting of Afghan women inside the country who participated virtually, and some who were here in Brussels, and Afghan women from across Europe, North America, other parts of the world, who we engaged with, listened to, and discussed the situation in Afghanistan. I have, on a number of occasions, spoken to Mr. Massoud remotely. I have made it clear to him, and he understands that the EU position is clear. We do not support armed resistance, neither politically or in material ways. But I still have found it useful to speak to him and to listen to him and his analysis. I have also mentioned this, by the way, when in my talks with the Taliban, and I've been completely transparent about that. But there are, of course, other groups in between armed resistance and the Taliban. And we see in the last few weeks and months a number of initiatives coming up in different parts of the world, of some of them including former politicians or leading figures. And I welcome that because I think there is a need for a broader dialogue. Some of these may be an alternative to the Taliban. Some of them may just be committed to the country and have a positive role to play. But we, the EU, are not going to convene, take the lead, make decisions, try to pick and choose who the Afghans want to have as possible future leaders or as influential people. That has been tried, not so much by the EU, but by others in the past, and we were not very successful. And I think so we are happy to attend meetings, we are happy to enter into dialogue, we are happy to listen, but we are not going to organize any big conferences and trying to bring the alternatives or the opposition together. I have a lot of trust in Afghans. I have a lot of trust in Afghans' capabilities, resources, and knowledge about who is who and what is needed. And I would rather think that we should take a listening position rather than one which involves taking sides or pushing for certain people.
So you mean that there is no hope for something similar like Bonn in 2001 under, let's say, EU leadership or UN leadership for the future of Afghanistan? Because some people are expecting that EU may take the lead and convene something similar to Bonn in the maybe future.
For the time being, I don't see this as happening, and I wouldn't see it as a positive step. And we all know that the views about Bonn vary considerably. I personally was not involved, of course, at the time. Looking back, I see one of the shortcomings of the Bonn conference was precisely that an important group that had just been defeated was not included and invited, namely the Taliban. I don't think that's the main reason why they came back, but I think that may be part of the reason. So again, the choices need to be made by Afghans. Can a big international conference be organized? Possibly. But again, we see so many different groups forming, which again I welcome. But I see that this will probably take some time for them to sort out, to the extent possible, their differences, or at least agree on certain principles. And I would still prefer to see them calling for and inviting for a conference rather than being invited from outside.
And my two last questions. There were talks that the EU in the past 20 years followed the US policies in Afghanistan, mainly. Is there an independent EU policy toward Afghanistan now? And if yes, what are the elements?
There is clearly an EU policy towards Afghanistan, which was defined last year by our foreign ministers in council conclusions in September last year, and that is what we are working on. It involves a number of elements: continued commitment to the Afghan people, which takes both political and material form in as humanitarian assistance and as basic needs and livelihoods assistance. 350 million euros each, so quite considerable amounts. It is about not isolating the country or isolating even the Taliban, and that's where the engagement, not only with the Taliban, but also with the Taliban come in, as we talked about, around the benchmarks. Non-recognition, suspension of traditional development assistance through the government. So our assistance now is provided mainly through UN organizations and humanitarian partners, but not through the de facto authorities. And another element is our engagement with regional countries and partners, including the US. So there is an independent policy. There is a policy defined by the EU and by our foreign ministers. Many of our objectives, a stable and secure Afghanistan at peace with itself and with its neighbors, where human rights are respected, with an inclusive government, where our principles and objectives shared by others, including the United States, included by many of the regional actors, and including to some extent, as I mentioned, even by Russia or China. But it is not that we are dictated, our objectives are dictated by the US or any other of our partners. We work well together with them. We may have some distinct concerns. I think migration, to the extent that there would be mass migration out of Afghanistan if the economic situation gets really bad, or if the security situation deteriorates, it is likely that Europe, for example, would be more affected by that than the United States would be. We may have different resources. United States, as a member of the UN Security Council, holder of a large part of the frozen assets of Afghanistan, for example, and with specific sanctions, in addition to UN sanctions, have other instruments than the EU has. So I think there is a lot of overlap, there is a lot of coherence, and we work very well together. But it is clear that it is a separate and a policy that we define.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. My last question, you have said that you oppose any further armed conflict in Afghanistan. What if local uprising against the Taliban gets stronger and bigger? What will be the EU position at that time?
I've said that the EU doesn't support armed resistance. It is ultimately, I think, the choice of Afghans how they see the future of the country and which means they choose. And some may think that armed resistance is the only thing remaining for them. I don't think it is likely to be successful in the short term. We, of course, know the price of armed resistance, but that is a price that many Afghans have decided to pay. But I also see the risk that if armed resistance develops, increases with various groups, I would see an increased risk of intervention, or at the minimum support by different actors outside, by different neighboring countries for various groups, with an increased risk that ultimately they would get even further pulled into the conflict than they are now, and therefore a risk of instability, further instability inside the country, obviously because there's an armed conflict, but also instability to the region. So it is really something beyond let's say, the moral choice and the individual choice and the consequences it will have in terms of, or would have in terms of risks and suffering, something that I see as very, very risky for the security and stability of the region. And that is, as I mentioned, the stability of the region, in addition to a livable Afghanistan, is really the core parts of our policy and our policy objectives.
Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you so much for having me.